Part 2. Steps to construct a table of specifications. Now that Angela knows what a TOS is and its main characteristics, Colin focuses on how to properly construct this tool. To illustrate how to go about putting together a TOS, Colin mentions that it's necessary to do it in context. Thus, Angela's colleague proposes imagining the case of Elisa Morales, who works in a small public rural school named La Esperanza. She teaches her 4th grade group using the action-oriented approach, or AOA, and she has to teach 5 English lessons per week. Before Colin continues, Angela asks if the number of lessons per week would have an impact on the design of the TOS. Excellent question, replies Colin. He then explains that depending on the type of school, English teachers may teach 3 lessons per week, others 4 or 5 lessons per week. In the case of private schools, they usually have more lessons per week. Consequently, the TOS varies. Now, Elisa's planning is based on the scenario Take Care, Level 4, Unit 4. The information in the unit comes from the national and official syllabus. This provides Ms. Morales with the goals to achieve for all the language areas. So, Elisa has to include the language skill goals, which she covered in a 4-week class period. One last detail we need to mention before jumping into the steps to create this tool is that Elisa needs to design a 20% paper and pencil test. So let's now discuss the steps. Step 1 in the process is determining how many lessons during the month were spent on each of the objectives related to reading, writing, and listening from the unit. As a reminder, reading can include vocabulary and writing can include grammar structures. The information required for Step 1 was recorded in Elisa's weekly planning and can now be included in the TOS. Note that we have already filled out the administrative information we mentioned earlier. Also note that for now, we will include just the letter and number of the objectives because, as we will see later, these still need to be turned into indicators of learning, which we will discuss in Step 2. Now, although the unit taken from the syllabus has 2 objectives per skill, Elisa decided to include only 1 for reading and writing. Accordingly, she decided not to include objectives R1 and W2. Angela interrupts and asks if it is okay not to include certain objectives in your planning and test design. Well, replies Colin, it is not advisable for Elisa to eliminate objectives from the units. But in this example, Elisa probably used a different evaluation component to assess objectives R1 and W2, as in daily work observations and/or assignments. But Elisa must not eliminate objectives from her lessons because she is expected to complete the annual plan. Now Colin moves on to explain Step 2, turning objectives into indicators of learning. This is necessary because the objectives that we saw in the previous chart are written in general terms. But for a test, English teachers usually work with indicators of learning. In other words, descriptions of observable, specific, and measurable behaviors that provide necessary information for evaluation. Let's see an example of how we can transform objectives into indicators of learning. So let's take R2, which reads, understand much of what is written in short, simple texts on subjects with which they are familiar and/or in which they are interested. So, to turn this into an indicator of learning, we could take understand much of what is written and change it for identifies facts and details. Then, in short, simple texts could become in a short and simple text. Finally, on subjects with which they are familiar and/or in which they are interested could turn into about illnesses, symptoms, and treatments. Now we can include the objectives worded as indicators of learning in the TOS. Now Colin continues with step 3, determining a preliminary number of points. Now to do this, we should mention that there are 2 rules we can use to determine the preliminary number of points in a test: the 10-point rule and the rule about multiplying the percentage by 2 and considering 5 points below or 5 above. For a detailed explanation on these rules, refer to the course resources. In this case, Elisa decides to use the 10-point rule. Hence, her paper and pencil test will have 30 points. We can now include that number in the TOS. Colin then moves on to step 4, figuring out the constant to obtain the number of points to evaluate each indicator of learning. In this step, we need 2 formulas. The first one helps us figure out the constant. This figure is obtained by dividing the total number of points by the total number of lessons. In the case of Elisa, this constant would be the following: 30, which is the preliminary number of points, divided by 16, which is the total number of lessons used to cover all the objectives, which equals 1.87. With the constant, Elisa will now be able to obtain the number of points assigned to evaluate each indicator of learning. Here we need the second formula. To obtain the number of points to evaluate this indicator of learning, it is necessary to multiply the number of lessons by the constant. In the case of objective R2, it would be 4, which is the number of lessons, multiplied by 1.87, which is the constant, and which equals 7.5. This number could be rounded up to 8 points or rounded down to 7, whichever Elisa decides. Now let's include this information in the TOS. Finally, Colin gets to the last step, deciding how to distribute the points among the corresponding types of items. Now that Elisa has determined how many points correspond to each indicator, she can decide how to distribute the points in the corresponding types of item. At this point, Angela is ready to design her test, making sure that it really reflects the work done in class with the students. And now Angela, Colin, and Elisa wish you good luck constructing your own TOS. Bye-bye.